Thank you everyone for coming. Cosmin and Freya, thanks for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here. It's not easy to be speaking after Lucas, but I'll do my best. In a way, my talk will be standing on his shoulders, we'll get back to it. Actually, I think I'd love to get back to his talk after mine during the group conversation. In the early 90s, Jacques Derrida, the iconic French philosopher who coined the term deconstructivism, visited the University of Geneva on a brief visiting professorship. And I was a student there at the time, but I had just started and I had never heard of him, so I didn't check him out. But his presence left a very lasting impression. According to the oral history of Geneva, he broke his arm on campus while trying to stand on a skateboard. And one of my tutors at the time, an assistant professor called Bernard Schlurick, taunted Derrida shortly thereafter and said that you and your radical agenda, the most dangerous thing you ever wind up doing is trying to impress the ladies on campus by standing on a skateboard. Whereupon, apparently, Derrida responded somewhat angrily and said, radical agenda, well, you can go and hand out your flyers outside the car factory as much as you want. You will see that nobody gives a fuck. The ideology of tomorrow is being produced right here at the university, so this is where I'm going to be in the immediate future. And it was a story that was bubbling around and that made a huge impression on me as a student. As a student, you're very receptive towards these theoretical pictures in a way that later you are maybe less. And within the contemporary art field, the Derridean impulse, at least the idea of deconstructivism, has become something of an inspirational leitmotif that guides, I think, pretty much, well, let's say, many of our actions within the field. But I'll be getting to that in a second. Suffice to say that deconstruction in the broadest, most popularized sense of the term, the idea of unpacking the premises that conceal power dynamics is very much, the moral horizon, as we saw in several talks today and yesterday. But the interesting thing about what Derrida was saying in his testy retort is that he had no problem with power. He did not have a problem with institutional responsibility, even in the most stuffy sense of the term, and this is something that within contemporary art is far less interiorized, and which is the much bigger, the tougher nut to crack when it comes to espousing anything that remotely comes close to the political promise of deconstructivism. This is something I've been grappling with for a little while now, and for the lecture for Hong Kong, I was attempting to be a little more site-specific. I was fascinated by the headlines coming out of this city with respect to activism, student activism in particular. And the question here, in a way, it was answered by Amy the day before yesterday when she pointed out that contemporary art very often learns from student activism, even if it often thinks that the references that it's taking in, the models that it's aspiring to, actually come from other contemporary art spheres. And actually, the second part of the title, I guess, maybe offering is something a little too mild as a term. I would say that contemporary art is ramming itself down the throat of student activists and other spheres of cultural and political production with much bravado over the past decade, and this is part of the challenge that I want to sink my teeth into today. The student angle is something that I'm still trying to figure out. I haven't found all the clear-cut answers yet, so there might be moments when it's a little messy, but bear with me, you'll get the gist of my argument. My point of departure is that both the university and contemporary art are undergoing processes of stratification. That they are both under the sign of a certain kind of mainstreamification, democratization, heightened modes of access, and at the same time, they are playing increasingly palpable roles within the corridors of power, and a gatekeeping capacity and otherwise. And if you look at the universities, bachelor degrees are now a mass phenomenon. If you look at student activism in many, many parts of the world, it's no longer this moral force, vanguard mystique type of thing. It's much more a question of populist coalition building and so on and so forth. Students have become a whole demographic that businesses can now pitch to quite comfortably. While I was flying here, the front page of the not New York Times, but Financial Times was complaining that vast sectors of the industry are now just looking at students and are not recruiting anything beyond. Like, this is the point to which the demographic has become a very ample and generous one. And at the same time, the financial price for accessing the institutions which call the shots at the tip of the pyramid, the financial cost of accessing them is rising. And the institutions which are sitting at those inner circles, and I think that there still are such institutions, I know many will disagree with me, they are just as comfortably conservative as they ever have been. If you look at contemporary art, it's quite easy to argue that there is a similar twin dynamic at play. The democratization of contemporary art, I'm not just talking about the queues outside our museums, I'm also talking about this firmly entrenched ethos of art, contemporary art being an open-ended thing. Lucas was asking, he was challenging us to think, who could presume to define contemporary art? The position that I'm trying to argue is that it has been defined, and that the definition of being an operation that lends itself in all generosity, epistemic and otherwise, to the audience, that is what defines contemporary art in a prescriptive manner, aggressively prescriptive manner. It is a gesture which crowns the audience king and queen, that produces a subject position which is cosmopolitan, supposedly creative, conspiratorial, but that in effect does not allow for any leeway beyond a very tightly controlled, shall we say, hermeneutic playing field. And this democratic gesture, at least, is an attractive one. And I think it is filling the museums, just like it is filling smaller venues. It is doing so across the world. And it is going hand in hand with the opposite dynamic as well. The financial price of entering the corridors of power of contemporary art, if you will, is also getting higher and higher. You do need, there is a class barrier. You do need a certain measure of not just financial support to traverse that corridor of free labor that is asked of you until you can finally make a living. But there's also a sense of middle-class entitlement that is actually fostered by that very, I call it a moral economy, by that very supposedly open-ended gesture to the audience. The financial price of being part of the professional playing field is increasingly high. And these stratifications, what is interesting about them is that both in a university context and in a contemporary art context, you still have a whiff of a sentimental investment in political agency that does not necessarily have much to do with the track record. There is this idea of an emancipatory potential which is hard to expel and which will not be exorcised anytime soon. It's part and parcel of the hard drive. And this too I'll get to in a second. Actually, I'll get to it now. The question of political agency, if you look at student activism, it's very hard to see it as a good object in and of itself. If you look at examples of student activism throughout recent history, you will see that students have been instrumental not only in toppling murderous regimes, but also in entrenching them. It's not hard to find examples and counter-examples of student activism being, mobilized for very non-progressive ends, shall we say. So it doesn't just lend itself to the idea of, an inherently democratic vanguard. I found the newest publication by Judith Butler to be quite helpful. It was published about half a year ago. It's called Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly. And it's looking at assemblies in general and the potentials thereof. But reading it, it's pretty clear that it's written by a university professor who spends a lot of time on campus. And it very much is an account of what student activism can amount to. And the core concern of the book that she keeps coming back to, almost like a refrain, is, and I'll quote a sentence from the introduction, the specific thesis of this book is that acting in concert can be an embodied form of calling into question the inchoate and powerful dimensions of reigning notions of the political. I'll summarize. Acting in assembly can be an embodied form of calling into question reigning notions of the political. Now, the question to me here, in comparison, because I'm trying to figure out whether contemporary art has something to learn from student activism, the question here is whether this is enough. In some ways it's a lot, in some it might not be quite enough. Moving from student activism to contemporary art just for a second, I'm using this term in a very brash fashion. I see contemporary art as a moral economy which produces similar, if not identical, subject positions across the world, which is why I do not think that the inclusion of up until now marginalized portions of the globe into contemporary art is anything emancipatory at all. The inclusion of previously excluded fields within what I am calling contemporary art has economic benefits as a job market, for example, cultural capital and others, but not in the sense of the political promise that contemporary art was imbued with over decades. I do not think that that has any traction whatsoever. The reason why I'm getting to this somewhat grumpy conclusion, shall we say, I've put together a glossary which has become a very useful didactic tool during lectures. Over the last few years, I've been putting together a list of terms that curators and artists use when they're describing a good object, when they're trying to describe where they're getting to, or when they try to describe what is the best case scenario in terms of the atmosphere, the intellectual atmosphere, the political traction that they create in the room. And it started out with these 4 words that I thought, I would jokingly call them the A words, and they're very different. They have very, very distinct histories and baggages. But within the field of what I am calling contemporary art, they become very comparable and they dovetail with one another. And this dovetailing becomes clearer if I move on to the key words that have accumulated over the years since. And they, together, I would say that, again, some of them have violent institutional histories that took a lot of determination to bring to any kind of conclusion in the public sphere. But within this moral economy that I've been describing, it amounts to an ontological liberalism that allows us to persistently pose our activities as a calling into question the police order without at any moment theorizing or historicizing the moment when suddenly the police order was us. I mean, it's always, you know, it posits even a turn. If you look at the, I think turn is in there. Turn, which sounds very benign. A turn is a turn away from something. Not to mention the other examples of conceptual paraphernalia which point to the act of undermining, challenging, questioning history with a big H, truth with a big T, and the institution with a big I, and so on and so forth. Now, what I'm interested in here is, first of all, how to read through this glossary in an attempt to understand how it's possible that contemporary art has become part and parcel of the corridors of power, and yet allows us to so comfortably disidentify with power at every moment. And what I'm hoping to find within student activism and other traditions is an acceptance of privilege that does not lead to an intuitive rejection of any mode of institutional responsibility, but instead uses all these grim things that have been talked about over the last few days in a manner that allows for a dialectical reversal. And when it comes to student activism, I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so just looking at three different snapshots, three different moments, which more or less abide by the decade that I've been accorded. One example that's more from the art world, one from the great outdoors, and one that's a little bit of both. So in 2008, the Biennale in Taipei was curated by Man Ray Su and Vasif Kortun. And I did not see this Biennale, but from what I've heard, it was an attempt to offer contemporary art as a lens through which to see the forces of globalization that had been unleashed over the past decade. And a number of the artists ascribed to more or less a kind of a temperament that you could call an activist one. And this is the museum in which it unfolded, the Taipei Museum of Fine Arts. And 2 years after that, I curated an edition with Hongjon Lin with much help from Freya Cho. And while we were preparing the Biennale, there was an anecdote, another theoretical picture, if you will, that Hongjon told me that haunted the preparations of the show. He told me the story of a demonstration that took place right outside the museum shortly after the opening, where students had confronted the police on the occasion of the visit of a Chinese official. And the confrontations had escalated, become violent. There were burning cop cars and so on and so forth. And the artists in the Biennale were watching this from far away, mainly through Facebook. And they became frustrated with this idea of being stuck in the museum while all the trappings of political agency are being put into play full force just outside. So this became, a source of great frustration. So I won't go into how we kind of use this as a stepping stone for our own curatorial purposes. What I'm interested in is the familiarity of this kind of refrain. It's a familiar frustration, no? We love to say that, we're stuck in a bubble, that contemporary art could or should have more political agency than it has presently, but we don't really have an effect on the world outside, and so on and so forth. And we say these things, but I think we say them in the same way we say life's a bitch or time will heal all wounds. It's not really something that you dwell on or think through to a logical conclusion. If you look at, I mean, it's very easy to see, if you did dwell on it for a moment, that the burning cop cars are an aesthetic phenomenon par excellence, or to see in which ways a Biennale has political agency, in that it is a future-oriented operation. It's an administrative effort. It's an organizational effort. It's an effort in persuasion, seduction, doctrine, what have you. And it leaves traces. It leaves traces economically, geostrategically, urban planning, you name it. We know these things. But they don't figure into the moral economy in any explicit sense, because this would raise questions pertaining to, what ideology of tomorrow are we producing, other than challenging, supposedly, the one that is guiding us in our work. Just after the opening of the 2010 Taipei Biennial, I moved to upstate New York, 2 hours north of New York City, to teach at a master's program called the Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College, a beautiful place called the Hudson Valley. So for 3 years, I was surrounded only by squirrels and curators. And actually, it was a total of, those were 3 years full-time. There were 5 years in total that I taught there. And all those 5 years were spent during a period of all-out war. It was during this period that the US occupied both Afghanistan and Iraq. It happened before, but the occupation was ongoing. And what is fascinating is that not one of us, not me, not my students, not my colleagues, not one of us did any exhibition or even an event that addressed this. None of us trusted contemporary art to do what we trusted a novel to do, or a journalist to do, or documentary film to do. And I'm sure that one day people will say that the wars haunted our exhibitions like Empire haunted the novels of Jane Austen. But the fact of the matter is no one dared to go there. However, aside from the occupations of the Middle East, the occupation that did unfold with much drama and which did suck in our institution was the occupation of Wall Street. And obviously, I'm also interested in the question of whether there are possible overlaps with Occupy Central, although I know that there are different objectives, different languages at play. I want to zoom into the idea of an occupation for a second. After those 3 years amongst the squirrels, we moved to Palestine for a few years, and obviously there the term occupation became an even more charged, even somewhat unbearable term, especially because it felt like such a euphemism amidst the de facto demographic and ecological butchery that was going on around you. But what was fascinating was still the commonality that runs through such various renditions of the term. In order to occupy, you need to otherize. You need to see yourself as inherently other to what you are occupying. Now, this is kind of banal, but I think it's worth insisting on in a context where, if we keep thinking about contemporary art, the idea of inherent placelessness, inherent porosity, inherent open-endedness, transversality, the suggestion that the artist does not have an institutional home to return to, this lends a very particular spin on the idea of an occupation. The artist can occupy pretty much from nowhere in a blaze of critical virtue. She can have her cake and eat it too, politically speaking. There's also a temporary factor that comes into play when you're talking about an occupation. Even if you're overstaying your welcome, you will, dead or alive, leave eventually. And this, along with the moment of authorization, is what leads to the all-encompassing aggressive intensity of the occupier's presence. An intensity only enhanced by the seemingly temporary nature of the intrusion. I looked at the term's etymology, and it's interesting that over the late Renaissance, in much of Europe, the term was considered rude and improper, because to occupy meant to have sex. Occupying someone meant something very particular, and I suppose it's fair to say that there are few options that are more immersive and more intense than intercourse, indeed. I know that it looks like I am trying to debunk or demystify or ridicule the idea of an occupation by, comparing it to contemporary art in this way. Ultimately, during the last few minutes of my presentation, I would like to argue the opposite. I know why this is creating this impression, and I'm trying to spark this notion deliberately, but it's not really where I'm trying to get at. After Palestine, fall of last year, we moved to Oxford, where the I don't know how many of you have heard of the student movement Rhodes Must Fall. It began at the University of Cape Town last year. It was an initiative to remove the statue of a man called Cecil Rhodes, who was basically a mining tycoon and a politician of British descent and of firm imperialist credentials, who bequeathed a great deal of money in his will to various colleges and universities in the hope of entrenching British imperialism further. So exactly this idea that Derrida was talking about, put into practice quite plainly. Last year in Cape Town, there was a student movement to remove the statue in question, and this was picked up by students in Oxford with using a very similar vocabulary of decolonization. When I first heard of this, I had mixed feelings, because moving there from the Middle East, you couldn't help but feel impatient, and you couldn't help but wonder whether certain concerns among student activists were a little too inward-looking, a little too campus-specific, when so much brutality was unfolding outside. And it was very funny, just as a parenthesis, to see that the ambassador of the US to the UN expressed a similar concern, or at least the idea of mixed feelings towards this kind of drift that is unfolding on US campuses, amongst the elite universities at least. But I think that this is somewhat unfair and superficial. It's fascinating to note that the movements both in Cape Town and in Oxford crystallize around statues of one single individual. It's also interesting that they are differently situated. In Cape Town, the rather confident placement, almost at ground level, allowed one student to throw human feces at it at one moment. This would be harder in Oxford. You'd have to have quite a good aim to reach all the way up there. After having spent a few months in England, it was plain to see that this movement was responding to an intellectual climate where the idea of, for example, the abolishment of slavery is celebrated with much gusto, whereas the notion that England was instrumental in institutionalizing the slavery economy in the first place routinely goes unsaid. And it's very hard to underestimate the impact of such a gesture within a climate such as this. The Guardian newspaper had a fantastic piece where the will of Cecil Rhodes was actually quoted at length. And I think it's also worth taking a quick look at it today as an example of the vision that Rhodes had in terms of how a university should be producing the ideology of the future. It should be developing a secret society, the true object whereof shall be extension of British rule throughout the world, the perfecting of a system of emigration from the UK, and especially the occupation by British settlers of the entire continent of Africa, the Holy Land, many other places, including the seaboard of China. So the critics of the Rhodes movement, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, insist that Rhodes, and I quote Amit Chowdhury from The Guardian, they insist that Rhodes was a man of his time, suggesting his time had nothing in common with our own. But if you replace the word British with Western and United Kingdom with the West, sorry, Roger, you find this statement in his will encapsulates not only Rhodes' vision, but a vision of the world today, one that has a fresh lease on life in the last 2 decades, in which unequal access to opportunity and mobility is structurally embedded as the norm. Now, to get back to the question that I keep asking from the beginning, is Rhodes must fall, the idea of the removal of this statue as a synecdochal approach to decolonization, is this enough? Is this another act of undoing that does not go in any imminent direction? As I've hinted before, I don't think that that is fair. There are actually refreshing differences that come up the more I look at both the Occupy movements and Rhodes Must Fall in unison and in counter comparison to contemporary art. There are 2 differences that I'll name now, and one commonality that I'll end with. So, one difference that is quite palpable is the difference in the approach to location. If the ontological liberalism that I was describing earlier can offer you the opportunity to claim to speak to various places at different times via a default notion of formalized subversion, student activism has no particular investment in ungrounding, deterritorializing, dislocating, so much as, I know this is a generalization, but this is the hypothesis I'm working with, but about entrenchment, specificity, investment, plot, and location. And it is thanks to that particular commitment, to that particular string of strategic modes, it is thanks to those that it dominates the headlines and perseveres in ways that contemporary art rarely can. In the light of this, the temporal aspect of an occupation is actually its forte. The knowledge of being something temporary is what unleashes a passion to be reckoned with. This is not the same as the stepping stones to the further stepping stones of contemporary art. It is not the same as postponing the moment of payback to some post-capitalist situation of redemption. If we think back to those participants in the Taipei Biennale 2008, they were debating their frustration, their melancholia, via Facebook, email, and Skype. But that's not really the problem. That's not what distinguishes the embodied approach of a student, of activist, to that of an artist or curator. What is interesting is that the moment where there was a concrete embodiment, a concrete moment of moving individuals through space, a moment of creating the kind of assembly that Butler was talking about, along the lines I was quoting in the beginning, this opportunity was used basically to set up a thematic group show. And this is a format which not only pits artists against each other in competition, it is also the format which caters most elegantly and efficiently to the open-endedness, the indeterminacy that I was describing in the beginning. If you think about it, even a thematic group show that has a very daring hypothesis will, by definition, point to the art, which in turn will be pointing back to the curatorial premise in some kind of heliocentric manner, which means that any scrutinization of the art, radically rigorous scrutinization of the art, is just as rare as a rigorous scrutinization of the curatorial premise, because there's an oscillation between the two, which works in unison. Moreover, the installation shots that we then use to propagate our biennials as curators or to discuss our work as artists in installation shots are not capable of conveying the moments of tension, the intellectual atmosphere, the conversations, the materialities that do emerge from these embodied moments. In sum, student activists have answers to the question that Butler raises that contemporary art cannot compete with. And to quote another sort of nugget from the book, what does it mean to physically assemble when the conditions for physical assembly are degenerating? I'll move on to another point. The second difference that I wanted to highlight between this rather brash characterization of student activism in comparison to the moral economy of contemporary art. And that is the difference in the language used for labor invested. In contemporary art, you partake in its moral economy by virtue of being part of the field, by virtue of doing a talk at a Parasite conference on student activism or on other topics too. Whereas if you talk to people who have spearheaded movements such as Occupy, it becomes clear, and this was later confirmed by articles, essays that I read by scholars who actually look at this as their object of study, it's only ever a tiny minority of students who ever participate in student activism. And there's no misunderstanding as to who is participating and who is not. There is no misunderstanding as to who, and then within this group, there's no misunderstanding as to who is doing the organizational legwork that in some cases is also statistical, legal, administrative, and quite tedious. I'll end by going back to what I started with. The uncomfortable question of stratification. Edward Aspinall is an Australian scholar who specializes in histories of student activism in East Asia, particularly Indonesia. And he likes to point out that the category is contingent upon constant turnover. It's linked to a biological life cycle. Out of our, 50 years of active adult life, there are maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 that we spend as students. And maybe this ageist subtext has chronopolitical implications. Aspinall likes to refer to marginal elites. He has noticed that student activists tend to be less harshly, less violently repressed, by and large, than the brunt of the population. And his hypothesis is that this is because students eventually fill the technostructure. Students are needed. This is a point that to me is key in differentiating between activism at large and student activism in particular. The question of does intuitive proximity to power necessarily play a part in the way that student activism unfolds? You could say probably, and kind of squint and look very apologetic about it, because that's what you are trained to do, that's what you intuitively do if you come from the moral economy of contemporary art. You could also say probably with a little more confidence. It feels very counterintuitive to do so because this would imply that there is anything even potentially interesting, promising about being part and parcel of the corridors of power. It's kind of an unpleasant place to be. It's a claustrophobic place to be. But I think that if contemporary art wants to come to terms with the why, come to terms with the question of to what end we're even doing this stuff, and what possibilities do we have at our disposal. And one of these possibilities is the privilege of being able to create an audience, of being able to create a public, of being able to kickstart even genuinely democratic forms of populism in the best of cases. I think if we wish to try and answer these questions just a little more seriously, then the ontological liberalism that I've been complaining about is not quite enough. So if both student activism and contemporary art are in a privileged position to forge these publics, then all the better. And I'll end on that. Thank you.